Hello, I'm John Jovich, and seated to my right is Dr. David Krieger, who is the Professor of History and Political Science at Paducah Community College. First of all, I'm happy to have you with me here, Dave. And
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. We're seated right now in the living room of the Angles, the home of the 35th Vice President of the United States, Alvin William Barkley. Alvin Barkley was a United States Congressman, United States Senator, Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Harry Truman's Vice President from 1949 to 1953, and a man who lived here throughout most of his life, a man who valued this home very, very highly. Among the souvenirs here that Dave and I have examined and inventoried are not only the furniture, the original furniture that exists here, but thousands of items, campaign buttons, scrapbooks that he personally kept page by page, keys to cities that he visited, top hat, canes from inaugurations. His own clothes are on display here. The desk that he used and the chair that he used as vice president, numerous items, photographs, souvenirs of a man who had a very, very distinguished political career. And David, you know, as a fellow historian, it almost gives you the creeps to just be here, doesn't it?
That is true. It's somewhat remarkable to come into this home in which the furniture is arranged as it was when Barkley lived here. I might add about the furniture, Barkley had enjoyed antiques and enjoyed collecting antiques, and much of the furniture in here represents the collection that he, and in particular his first wife, developed during their 40-some years of marriage.
Dave, why don't we discuss for a little while the life of Alvin Barkley. He was born in 1877 and raised in Kentucky, of course. He was a very outgoing, extremely ambitious young man when he ran for Congress in 1912. Is that correct?
That is true. His interest in politics, I suspect, stems in part from the fact that one of his grandparents was related to Adlai Stevenson, and that of course made Alvin Barkley related to Adlai Stevenson. The irony of that, which of course would not be known to Barkley in the 1890s and early 1900s, is that Adlai Stevenson, of course, is the man who would win the Democratic nomination for president in 1952, when Barkley also tried to achieve that nomination. But politics, it appeared, was discussed within the home. Alvin Barkley took an interest in law, and a career in law, of course, also can mean for many lawyers a career in politics. Barkley, of course, living here in western Kentucky, experienced the hard times of West Kentucky farmers and farmers across the country in the 1890s, and the fiery campaigns on the part of William Jennings Bryan and the populists and other reform Democrats who wanted to improve the lot for the farmer and basically reform the country. So he lived at a time as a young man which was politically divisive in the country, and this, I think, would also spur his interest in politics. He ran for his first office, by the way, and was elected in 1905 as a McCracken County attorney, and he was only 28 years old at the time when he was elected to that office in 1905.
That, for a man to run for public office in his 20s in that day and time would be considered very rare. You didn't see political participation on the part of younger people as you do today in that day and age.
That is true, and in fact his rise to Congress was rather rapid. He served for 4 years as county attorney. In 1909 he ran for county judge here in McCracken County and was elected. And in 1912, he ran for the United States House of Representatives and, of course, was elected. And so his rise even through local politics was extremely rapid.
He ran for Congress in 1912, and that was the year of one of the hottest presidential races in the history of our country. The incumbent William Howard Taft, the Republican, was running against the Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson, Virginia, and the nominee of the Progressive or Boom Moose Party, Theodore Roosevelt. Naturally, Woodrow Wilson won that election on a plurality of the vote, and young Alvin Barkley had the chance to meet Wilson on several occasions in the White House, and they took a liking to one another.
That is true, and incidentally, one of the things that caught Wilson's attention about this freshman congressman from Western Kentucky in 1913 was that President Wilson happened to notice in passing when meeting with the freshman congressman that Alvin Barkley had written something down in shorthand. And that sparked Wilson's interest because Wilson also took shorthand and thought that shorthand was a skill that every man ought to have in order to keep track of correspondence and take notes. And that sparked a conversation among the two. I might add that Alvin Barkley's political hero, the man he most admired throughout his career, was Woodrow Wilson. Alvin Barkley is best described as a Wilsonian progressive. Of course, that would also be true of Franklin Roosevelt as well. And Alvin Barkley is also best described as an internationalist. He had strongly favored the League of Nations, which of course the United States did not join in the 1920s. And so his political outlook was based on that, really of his mentor, I guess we could say, his political mentor, Woodrow Wilson.
There are literally thousands of books that here in the Barkley Library that the majority belong to him, that are still preserved today, and there are numerous books, I mean, more than any other president, on Woodrow Wilson. So clearly he had a great admiration for that man.
That's true.
Going on, he was elected to the United States Senate in the late 1920s, and he really was an advocate of Western Kentucky. I mean, he did an awful lot for the constituents in this area, and it's very evident in his scrapbooks. I'm sure you'll attest to that. He became majority leader at a time when we were going through a period of depression,
right?
And FDR was of course in office. Franklin Roosevelt and Barkley had their differences as much as they had close relationships. Is that not?
That is true. Yeah, Barkley became a majority leader of the United States Senate in 1937 and held that position for 10 years, which was a long period of time for Senate majority leader. It appears in 1937 that Franklin Roosevelt indeed supported Barkley for majority leader. In 1938, Alvin Barkley strongly supported Roosevelt's court packing scheme. Now, the Supreme Court at the time was overturning all kinds of New Deal legislation, and Roosevelt wanted a Supreme Court more sympathetic to the New Deal. Barkley strongly supported that. Unfortunately for Alvin Barkley, however, Barkley and President Roosevelt came to a parting of the ways in 1944 over a tax measure, which Roosevelt vetoed. Barkley opposed that veto because Roosevelt was the first president who had ever vetoed a tax measure passed by Congress. Barkley resigned as majority leader and would be re-elected, but the tax measure was passed over Roosevelt's veto. Thereafter, although the two men would cooperate on other measures, the relation between the two men cooled. And it may account for the fact that in 1944, Alvin Barkley did not get the vice presidential nomination.
It's significant to note that this man had a continually good relationship with Harry Truman. They were close friends as political cronies, and when he became Truman's vice president in 1949,
right,
something transpired. Something changed the history of the vice presidency, and it was clearly evident that Truman wanted this man to be a part of his cabinet meetings, part of the National Security Council. He wanted to keep Barkley abreast of day-to-day and key presidential decisions, probably because Truman can remember how he felt on the day FDR died, April 1945, when he was called to the White House and he thought it was routine business, and Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Harry, brace yourself, I have news for you, the president is dead." And the story goes that Truman blinked behind his thick eyeglasses, and he looked up at Mrs. Roosevelt and he said, "Is there anything I can do for you, Mrs. Roosevelt?" And she replied, "What can we do for you, Harry? For now you are the one that is in trouble." He probably remembered so well the fact that he had to become president and then learn about the atomic bomb and the plans that we had for ending World War II that FDR clearly had a grasp of. So wouldn't you agree with me that Truman wanted Barclay to be as informed as possible if in fact his own heart stopped beating?
That is probably true, although in Franklin Roosevelt's defense it must be said that Franklin Roosevelt was only 3 months into his last term when he died, and I don't think Franklin Roosevelt expected to die. In fact, he was making plans for what he would do in his retirement years.
Right.
And so Truman obviously had not been informed. One of the interesting things, by the way, after Truman became president, he was always making rather self-depreciating comments about himself. And he would say, for example, to reporters, he said, "Well, boys, if you ever prayed for anybody, pray for me now. I need all the help I can get."
Right.
And Truman kept depreciating his ability to act as president. And Barclay, at one point in the mid-40s, before he was vice president, took Mr. Truman aside and said, these are not Barclay's words exactly, but probably said, "Now, Harry, you've got to stop running yourself down in public. You're President of the United States." And sure enough, Truman stopped apologizing for himself.
That is true. That is very true, and it's again indicative of the man. He was naturally ambitious, and he was ambitious enough and to realize his position, to realize that people expect leadership, and no doubt that's why he approached Truman in that manner. And probably Truman remembered that advice and held that in his consideration of his next vice president.
That's true, I think, and it's also true, I think, that Barclay worked very hard for Truman's election in 1948. I think if there's anything that anyone can really recall about the 1948 campaign, it's a picture of the Republican candidate the day after the election holding up the Chicago Tribune, a newspaper, and the big headline says, "Dewey elected President of the United States." That was a major journalistic flub. Truman had been elected. And one of the reasons is that Barclay, 71 years old, and hopped in an airplane and flew across the country, 150,000 miles by plane, and gave speeches everywhere across the country in favor of Truman. And what Barclay did was to encourage and charge up a rather dispirited Democratic Party workers who went out and redoubled their efforts to get Truman elected.
Barclay was a fantastic stump speaker, and it was not typical of a presidential or vice presidential candidate to travel the entire nation, the entire continental United States, as Barclay did. And in fact, it would not be until John Kennedy's time in 1960 he would be the first candidate to visit all 50 states, or perhaps all 48 states, let's say, because Hawaii and Alaska had just come in the year before. But Barclay, of course, was an effective vice president, very involved in Truman's decisions, and was affectionately known throughout the nation as the VEEP.
Mm-hmm.
And we have found from his granddaughter living here at the Angles, Dottie Barclay Holloway, that in fact it was her family that had come up with that familiar slogan. It was just so hard for them to keep hearing Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, and so they wanted to shorten that title out of respect to their grandfather. He served a very distinguished career in the United States Senate, and would be elected back to the United States Senate in 1954.
Right.
And quite an honor for a man to come back, and he defeated a very well-known later Kentucky senator who would later be re-elected to the Senate.
That's right. He defeated John Sherman Cooper.
Right.
Defeated him by a majority of 80,000 votes. So Barclay had been elected again for his last term in '54 by a landslide in the state. It was curious when Barclay returned to the Senate in 1955. He was offered his old seat down in the front of the chamber. And he said no, he would not take that seat because he lacked the seniority, and that he would rather sit on the back bench and have his desk way in the back of the chamber. The famous statement he made in Lexington, Virginia, where of course he died,
Right.
Was made after his discussion that he didn't mind sitting in the back of the Senate, lacking a leadership role, lacking prestige on important committees. He was just happy to be back in the Senate.
Right. And of course, you're referring to his death in Lexington in 1956, and it was April 30th to be exact. And he is speaking in a large, very hot auditorium. It was a very humid day in Lexington at the time, and it is Washington Lee University. And his very last words at the podium before the second Mrs. Barkley and literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 people, his last words were, and I quote, "I would rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to sit in the seats of the mighty." And immediately after making that comment, unquote, after making that comment, he just stepped back 1 or 2 steps and dropped dead on the stage of a massive quaternary. And naturally, members of the press and the audience just gasped, and Mrs. Barkley ran up to the stage and knelt over her husband, and it was determined that he had died instantly. But again, the words themselves say a lot about the man. He was religious. He was a good family man. He was a tremendous public servant, and
that is true. And he regarded his careers in politics as an honorable one, and would always feel a bit of anger when people would denounce politics as what you might call a second-rate career. He regarded politics as a noble calling.
Dave, as you know, we're fortunate in having here at the Angles the black and white footage taken of the Barkley funeral here in Paducah. And what we'd like to do is look at that footage at this time and show our audience exactly what transpired here in Paducah. Here we are at the Barkley Airport. It's already named for Alvin Barkley. He was there himself when it was named.
Right. Here, this is the airplane bringing former President Truman in at Barkley Field. And there you see Truman alighting from the airplane, and you'll see a better shot of him very shortly.
Harry Truman in person was only about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and yet he was, in person, he had a strong handshake. I met him when I was 7 years old, in fact, and he was a pretty scrappy fellow, very bold looking.
Here you see a shot of the funeral train, the train that brought the remains of Alvin Barkley from Washington, D.C. to Paducah. And there, of course, is Alvin Barkley's casket at the railroad station. And there you see the transit permit allowing the body to be shipped across state lines from Washington, D.C. to Paducah.
There's quite a tremendous crowd in Paducah. They really came from all over Western Kentucky, all over the nation for the funeral.
That's true. This is a shot outside the funeral home, and you can see the long line of people who are waiting to pay their last respects to Alvin Barkley. One of the things you might note in here is how dress styles have changed. Note the number of people wearing hats.
They certainly
hats
have.
are a rarity these days.
They certainly have changed. Customary of funerals of well-known political dignitaries in those days was military escort of jeeps, and this is only, what, 3 years after the end of the Korean War?
That's correct, yeah. Here you see Broadway Methodist Church, and it is here, of course, that the funeral service was held.
That is, of course, the way
There's the escort of military jeeps, which you just mentioned.
we can assume, I'm sure safely assume, this is Broadway we're looking at here.
Yes, I would think it is, right. There, in the center of the screen, you see Happy Chandler, who in the 1930s, there you see Chandler even closer, who in the 1930s became the arch rival of Alvin Barkley in a very bitter senatorial campaign. Chandler, of course, became baseball commissioner. Served.
Here's the hearse pulling up to the church.
There's Adlai Stevenson, who of course had wrested the Democratic nomination from Barkley in 1952.
And at the time that this footage is taken, he is presently seeking the Democratic nomination in 1956.
That's correct, yeah.
The pallbearer is carrying the late Vice President's body into the church for the services. Following behind, we'll see the Vice President's second wife, I believe, Mrs. Jane Hadley Barkley.
Right. That was a, yes, there she is right in the center of the screen. She's going up the stairs now. It was a May-December romance in 1949, which created, sparked interest across the entire country. There you see the large crowd standing outside of the church while the services were underway. The services are over now, and we don't have any footage of the services in the church, but here, of course, you see the coffin being borne out of the church.
Well, there are many faces we probably won't recognize because they simply didn't get into the camera shots. It's significant to note that men such as future President Lyndon Johnson were inside the church at the time. Here we see former President Truman coming out of the church. To his right is Governor Chandler, and immediately behind Truman is future Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and to Humphrey's right, the then Senator of Missouri, Stuart Symington. There are the four. Look at how young Hubert Humphrey is in this picture. Stuart Symington himself ran for the presidency in 1960, as did Humphrey.
Right, as did Humphrey. And in Hubert Humphrey, you have a man who, in some ways like Alvin Barkley, wanted very badly to become President of the United States, tried very hard, but never attained the office.
That's true. There's, just to your right, right there is the then Governor of New York, Averell Harriman. Harriman became an advisor to many presidents. Again, we see Adlai Stevenson, again running for the presidency for the second time against Dwight D. Eisenhower. And that's very interesting footage, and in that we see a future vice president and at a former vice president's funeral. And again, LBJ was there. We didn't see LBJ.
That is true, yes.
And
Johnson at the time was occupying Barkley's old position of Senate Majority Leader.
That is correct. That is correct. I think it's significant at this time to note one of the reasons why we're here, and it's very significant in perhaps concluding the show in the long run. The Angles, located here in Paducah, this program will be showing throughout many communities in Kentucky. As the home of the former vice president, it's just immaculate in architecture, in historical preservation. The majority of the items that belong to Barkley are still here. And the family did just a wonderful job of preserving those items. The vice president only had one son, that was David, who passed away just recently. And David's daughter, Dottie Barkley Holloway, the vice president's granddaughter, presently lives here, and she conducts tours throughout this home. And what a remarkable thing it would be if this home can become a National Historic Site. It's not far from Whitehaven, which is in itself a historic site and now a visitor center here in western Kentucky, and it's only just a few miles down the road. The fact that Paducah has a chance to have, first of all, a historic site of this magnitude would really help the area, I believe, don't you?
I think it's a golden opportunity, and it's the kind of opportunity that comes only once. If we miss it now, if we fail to act now, we'll not have a second chance. And I might add, it is fascinating to come here right now, and I would hope that when it becomes a National Historical Site, that people will be able to go through the home much as they can now. It's interesting to come in here. You come into the center of the rooms. You can stop, you can look at pictures. There are some things, I think, which you could probably pick up and touch and feel. These keys to the city, which you mentioned earlier in the program. Heavy things. I don't know what kind of a door they would open, but this key to the city from Silver Springs, Florida, given to Alvin Barkley. And photographs abound. It is a fascinating place to visit.
It is, and here I have in my hands, this is the actual felt top hat, silk top hat that Alvin Barkley wore to his inaugural ceremonies in 1949. And just to your right there, Dave, if you want to pick that picture up, we have 11 by 14 black and white photograph showing President Truman riding with Barkley to the Capitol for the ceremonies.
Wearing this very same hat.
So it is very significant. Also here we have literally hundreds of canes that belong to the late Vice President. Numerous 8 by 10 photographs.
Yeah, this cane is rather remarkable with the horse head over here for the handle of the cane, and it also has Barkley's initials on it.
It certainly is wonderful. And you know, looking through the books in his library, many books by very well-known authors and very famous people were personally, of course, inscribed with long personal inscriptions. One book in particular from Harry Truman as president, the inscription is to the best vice president any man could ever have, from Harry Truman. Now that's quite an inscription.
That is.
But it's all here. And in fact, there's even a mirror here that actually once hung in the United States Capitol. But it's architecturally, it's beautiful. The home itself was built in the late 1850s, and again, the opportunity to make this the National Historic Site that it deserves to be, I think, would be more a tribute to the man, and that's probably the most important point we're trying to get across.
That's correct.
A tribute to the man himself. Do you have any closing thoughts on Alvin Barkley?
I think Alvin Barkley probably should be the great glory of his career, I suppose, is the same that was that for another famous Kentuckian, Henry Clay, and that is that the art of politics is compromise, to reconcile difference between all kinds of conflicting interest groups across the country. That's why Henry Clay is regarded as a great senator. That's why Alvin Barkley is regarded as a great senator and an outstanding vice president.
A fine tribute to the memory of a great man, Alvin Barkley.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us.